So a lot of people have been giving Jordan Peterson shit for a thing he said at one of his talks where somebody offered him a book, Solzhenitsyn's 200 Years Together, and I think he eventually accepted the book, but he declined to comment on the question, which was about the so-called Jewish question. And the individual offering him the book and posing the question, himself identified as Jewish. And people have been giving Peterson a lot of shit about this. I'm not going to give him any shit about that, because that's a hot potato. And if he doesn't want to take that up, if he thinks there are more productive or more, helpful questions he can address, that's fine. Like I said before, he's got a big platform. And, if he doesn't want that to be his hill to die on, if he thinks there are more gains to be made elsewhere, that's a perfectly fine decision to make. But it's not the case that Peterson won't address this question, because he has addressed this question, and I'll link to a video below where he does attempt to address this question and basically just describes the entire difference in Jewish overrepresentation in certain fields, especially cognitively demanding fields, to the IQ gap. There's supposedly an IQ gap of 15 points on average between Ashkenazi Jews and whites, and that could explain a large gap in representation in cognitively demanding fields, because the further, to the left of the distribution you go, or to the right rather, the further to the right of the distribution you go, the more overrepresented they're going to be, because the number of individuals at the extremes of the distribution drops off rapidly. But if at a given, high level of ability, Jews are less above average, than other groups, because their average is higher, then they're going to be proportionally speaking more of them at those levels. So he attempts to reduce it all to this, and I think that fails for a number of reasons. First of all, because there are more relevant gaps than just the IQ gap. There's also the ethnocentrism gap. Jews are fairly ethnocentric. They have a well-developed Jewish identity and culture and advocacy groups and everything else, and they're very protective of that identity. And they're very proactive in protecting that identity. And they have kind of carte blanche to practice that identity, whereas we don't have any kind of, official protection for our own. And why is this relevant? Why does this matter? Well, suppose that by ability alone they can gain disproportionate entry to elite universities, and then ultimately disproportionate representation on the faculties and staffs of those universities, in the administrations of those universities, including, let's say, the admissions departments. Well, if they're more ethnocentric than us, and furthermore, they can kind of pass as us, they look more or less like us, but they also know, who is and who isn't them. They know and care relatively more. And whites don't know or care who is or isn't Jewish for the most part. Once they've obtained disproportional representation in those institutions, then they can obtain even more disproportional representation by nepotistic means. If they know who applying is Jewish, who applying is them, if they know which students in their classes are them, if they know, they can do even subtle things, just like offering more after-hours assistance to certain students, or, any number of things to subtly influence the success, or the admissions, or the rise, or the publication, or the hiring of other members of their identity group. And they can do it subtly. It doesn't have to be explicit. And it's not like they're going to get caught. And even if they do, they have a get-out-of-jail-free card. So, being a minority, an ethno-religious minority, they basically have carte blanche to engage in this. And they have the motive, and they have seemingly the inclination. So they can obtain much higher much more disproportionate representation by those means than they could just on merit alone. Assuming only that they can obtain a little bit of disproportional representation by merit. And what do they use that influence for? They use it to attack the ethnocentrism and delegitimize and demonize and vilify the ethnocentrism of whites and deconstruct, and to make the ethnocentrism gap still wider, which presumably will make their overrepresentation still larger. So that appears to be what they use their influence for, and then they've acquired, by acquiring control of these gateway institutions, they acquire control over the indoctrination and education of new minds. And also, it's a gateway to status and influence. And so they can control that gateway, and they can be gatekeepers for the influencing class, and also shape their education and their indoctrination. So that's tremendously worrying. Jordan Peterson also asks, what do you want, less geniuses? Presumably implying that more geniuses is always a good thing. And, the existence of a small, capable, disproportionately successful minority is not necessarily going to be a bad thing. I mean, it could be mutually beneficial. Maybe if we let them specialize in our genius jobs, they'll do better, and they'll free us up for other things. We'll get to monopolize the drudge work or something helpful like that. I don't know what the argument is there, but it's not necessarily, there could be a comparative advantage thing going on. It could be a mutually beneficial specialization. Could be, hypothetically. But part of that depends on that genius being directed towards productive ends and not parasitic ends. And there are parasitic ends towards which you can direct genius. Whether it's rent-seeking and manipulation or subversion or, financial crimes or any number of other things. There are parasitic ends criminal ends to which you can direct genius. And so, the mutually beneficial nature of this relationship with these supposed geniuses is dependent on them confining their genius to productive applications. That's the only way it could possibly be mutually beneficial. And the problem with that is, when you have your own native geniuses, your own kin geniuses, there's a large degree to which altruism and trust are mediated by kinship evolutionarily, because kinship makes altruism and trust evolutionarily stable strategies. So, altruism is normally sacrificial or suicidal in natural terms or evolutionary terms. But when you have kinship, then when you're being altruistic, or when you're being trusting or trustworthy, which are kind of special cases of altruism, then you're helping out other instances of your own genes, and you're helping them to spread and to propagate. And so that's an evolutionarily stable strategy. It's evolutionarily rewarded. Now, abusing that altruism or that trust, or defecting on it, or taking advantage of it non-reciprocally, is evolutionarily self-punishing between kin, because you are harming other instances of your own genes and therefore eliminating them from the gene pool, at least to an extent. And so that kind of defection is relatively rare. When Bernie Madoff was arrested for squandering dozens of billions of dollars in a massive pyramid scheme, the thing, and most of it from other Jews like him, the thing that was most shocking to Jews, it seemed like, was not that he committed those crimes, but that he committed those crimes against other Jews. And now that kind of affinity fraud, because of high in-group trust, is relatively easy, but it's also comparatively rare, because engaging in that is evolutionarily punished. And so genes that would code for, or even kind of allow, parasitism towards kin are selected against rather strongly. And so it's kind of self-enforcing. But between non-kin, that enforcement mechanism doesn't exist, or it's greatly attenuated. And so if you have non-kin geniuses on the loose, then you have to devote more of your own geniuses to policing them, right? Because genius crimes may be subtle and sophisticated enough to only be detectable or perceptible to other geniuses. And so you have to devote geniuses to enforcement instead of to, productive genius stuff. And so, it could end up even being a losing proposition under those instances to have more geniuses about. So it's not necessarily going to be the case that more geniuses is always a good thing. It could be a good thing, it could not be, but it really depends a lot on the particulars. And one of the particulars is kinship and ethnocentrism. And so if you have in-group geniuses, they're probably going to do more productive stuff and less parasitic stuff. And if you have out-group geniuses, it might be the reverse. So where am I going with all this? This is just kind of barely scratching the surface of the issue, obviously, but it should be clear from now that just attempting to reduce this to a matter of the IQ gap is tremendously inadequate and does nothing to suggest that there's not a real question here. And in fact, there is a real question here, and anyone who delves into it will start to figure that out.